By the time the mountain man confessed to his new bride that he had not touched a woman in 12 long years, Josephine Davies already knew exactly how it felt to be unwanted. But that night in the loft cabin was still far in the future. On a blistering June afternoon in 1879, the stagecoach shuddered to a halt in the middle of Pine Valley, Idaho Territory. Dust rolled up in lazy clouds, clinging to everything it touched. Inside the swaying coach, Josephine "Joe" Davies braced one gloved hand on the worn leather seat and tried to steady both her body and her breathing. 31 years old, nearly 300 pounds, and carrying every rejection of her life in the same battered trunk as her clothes. The driver swung the door open and tipped his hat. "Pine Valley, ma'am. End of the line." End of the line. The words struck harder than he knew. Joe gathered her skirts, feeling the familiar pull of fabric across her wide hips, and eased herself down the iron step. The square was smaller than she'd imagined, just a scatter of buildings around a watering trough and a leaning hitching rail. No band playing, no curious crowd. Only a few townsfolk drifting about their business, and one man standing very still in front of the general store, watching the stage like a hunting hawk. Her heart lifted for an instant. Marcus Reed, her letter writer, her promised husband. Surely this must be him. Then the man stepped forward, and Joe's fragile picture cracked. He was too large, too wild, 6'4" if he was an inch, shoulders like a barn door, hair long and dark, drawn back with a strip of leather. A thick beard, streaked with gray, framed a weathered face carved by mountain winters and hard years. His shirt was tanned buckskin, not a rancher's clean cotton. A rifle rested easy in the crook of one arm as if it had grown there. This was no polite rancher who quoted poetry in his letters. This was a man who looked as if he belonged to the wilderness more than to any town. He stopped several paces from her, boots planted wide, green eyes searching her face as if he were looking for something he had lost a very long time ago. "Miss Davies?" His voice was a deep, rough rumble. Joe's fingers tightened around the handle of her valise. She swallowed. "I am Miss Davies," she said. "I am looking for Mr. Marcus Reed. He is expecting me." Pain flickered through the stranger's eyes, there and gone like a shadow across snow. "I know," he said quietly. "Marcus is my younger brother." The world seemed to sway under Joe's feet. Before we step deeper into these Idaho mountains and find out why a mountain man, not the rancher she expected, came to meet this fat, frightened bride, tell me in the comments where you're listening from in the world tonight. Are you hearing this story from a big city, a small town, or somewhere as quiet as Pine Valley? Silas Reed did not move toward her right away. Instead, he stood as if bracing himself against a blow only he could see coming. Behind him, Pine Valley went on with its quiet summer day. The clatter of a saloon door, the soft thud of a blacksmith's hammer, a woman calling her children in from the street. Life continued, indifferent to Joe's trembling fear. "I am Silas," he said at last. "Marcus's older brother." He shifted his weight, boots grinding dust. "And I'm afraid I didn't ride down here with good news." The air around Joe thinned. He isn't here to meet me?" "No, ma'am." Silas's jaw worked once before the words came. 3 weeks past, Marcus was thrown from his horse, broke his spine clean through. Doctor says he'll never walk again. For a moment, Joe heard nothing except her own pulse pounding in her ears. The letters, 43 of them, flashed through her mind. Marcus's neat handwriting, his gentle humor, the way he spoke of land and future and partnership, as if she were already beside him, as if she mattered. "Is he alive?" she whispered. "Yes," Silas said, angry, bitter, struggling, but alive. She nodded, even as a familiar dread rose inside her. Most men who discovered her size recoiled. A few were polite about it, others cruel, but none had ever paired their disappointment with disaster like this. Silas stepped forward, not looming, but careful, deliberate. "He sent me to meet you, to give you passage money back east." He hesitated. He didn't want you to travel all this way for nothing. Nothing. The word dug deep. Joe straightened her back, summoning the shred of pride she always carried like armor. "I've traveled 2,000 miles, she said quietly. "I didn't come for nothing. I came to meet the man I've been corresponding with. And I will." Silas blinked, surprised. "Ma'am, cabin life is harsh. Marcus he isn't himself. He may say things you'll regret hearing." "I've heard worse," Joe said. "Take me to him." His lips twitched, half admiration, half regret. "You're braver than most folks who come west." She gave him a wry, tired look. "They underestimate women with my size, but we don't survive without backbone." Silas nodded once, decisive. "Then I'll take you." He lifted her baggage, 2 heavy bags and a trunk most men struggled with, as if it were nothing, strapping them to his enormous horse. When he helped her mount, he did so with a gentleness that startled her. No flinching, no embarrassment, just steady, quiet strength. For a man who claimed to have forgotten living among people, he handled her with more dignity than anyone had in years. The moment they left town and entered the open trail, Joe finally allowed herself to breathe. The mountains rose ahead like a wall of blue and silver, harsh and beautiful under the summer sun. Silas walked beside the horse, long stride, steady and confident, as though he had been carved from the land itself. After half an hour of silence, she ventured, "You said Marcus is staying at your cabin." Silas nodded. "He needed someone to tend him. I'm all he's got." "And what about you?" she asked softly. "What did this accident interrupt?" His look told her she'd touched a wound. "Not much. I've lived alone up there for 12 years. Haven't had reason to come down often." 12 years, alone in the mountains. Joe couldn't imagine such solitude. Her loneliness was something she carried every day, but at least she lived among people. "Your wife?" she asked quietly. Silas didn't look up. "Dead. Fever took her." Pause. "I wasn't enough to keep her alive." The self-blame in his voice made her chest ache. For the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, she studied him not as a stranger, but as a man, one weathered by grief, shaped by isolation, and now forced back into the world by his brother's tragedy. He was intimidating, yes, but he was also unbearably human. Silas cleared his throat as if shaking loose memories. "Marcus talked about you in the weeks before the fall. He liked your letters. Said you had sense, education, humor." Joe looked down at her hands. "And did he mention anything else?" He hesitated. "No, ma'am. Just that he thought you'd make a strong partner." "Partner?" The word tightened Joe's throat. "He never asked for a photograph," she murmured. Silas looked up at her, eyes thoughtful. "A woman is more than her picture." She didn't answer. She wasn't sure she believed that anymore. By the time they reached the foothills, the sky had shifted to a deeper gold. A breeze whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of sap and earth. The trail widened as they climbed, and Joe saw ahead a clearing where a cabin stood, a single plume of smoke drifting from its chimney. Silas slowed. "We're here." And Joe braced herself for the first cruel humiliation she had not yet seen, but would soon shake the entire course of her life. Silas Reed's horse moved at a steady, powerful pace as they climbed deeper into the Idaho mountains, the air cooling, the world growing quieter with every turn of the trail. Pines rose like cathedral pillars on both sides, sunlight slipping through in narrow gold slashes. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried, a lonely, echoing sound that felt eerily fitting. Joe clung to the saddle horn, knuckles white. She was not accustomed to horseback riding, much less mountain trails carved by hooves and weather. The path was narrow, and the drop beside her steep enough to turn her stomach. Silas walked beside the horse, never letting go of the reins, never straying more than an arm's reach. "You're doing fine," he said quietly. "I don't feel fine," she admitted. He almost smiled. "Most folks don't on their first climb. You just stay on the saddle. I won't let you fall." The words struck deeper than he probably intended. No man had ever said such a thing to her, not in Pittsburgh, not on the long train ride west, not in any of the awkward attempts at courtship she'd survived in her 20s. Men had mocked, dismissed, ignored. But "I won't let you fall," that was something entirely different. They rode in silence a while longer, the only sounds the creak of leather and the rhythmic clop of hooves. The forest thickened, towering spruce and fir forming a green tunnel above their heads. The air smelled of sap and stone, sharp, clean, grounding. As her nerves settled, Joe found herself unexpectedly soothed. "This place is beautiful," she murmured. Silas nodded. "A man can breathe up here. The world feels honest." "It feels lonely," Joe said softly. He didn't disagree. "It is." The trail narrowed again as they crossed a shallow stream. Silas took her booted foot and steadied the stirrup so she didn't slip when the horse stepped onto the wet rocks. His hand was large enough to swallow her ankle, warm through the leather. "You've done this before," she said, embarrassed by how breathless she sounded. "Escorting travelers? Not in years." He glanced up at her. "But I've led pack horses across every trail in this region. Mountains don't forgive mistakes." "And you?" she asked. "Do you forgive mistakes?" He shrugged. "Other people's? Usually. My own?" A shadow crossed his features. "Not so much." They moved on, the canopy breaking occasionally to reveal glimpses of distant ridges, blue folds of earth stretching endlessly. Joe realized she'd never traveled anywhere so vast, so unconcerned with human lives. Back home, even the sky felt crowded. "Tell me about my brother," Silas said at last. Joe blinked. "Your brother? You knew him better these last months than I did. I want to hear what he told you." She hesitated. "He told me about ranch life, about books he liked. He asked about my childhood, my work, my skill with household matters." Silas nodded. "That sounds like him." "He never mentioned anything else?" she asked. "You mean your size," Silas said bluntly. The air froze in Joe's lungs. "Yes," she whispered. "No," he said simply. "He never asked. He never cared." Joe's eyes stung, but she blinked the emotion away. "Most men do." "That's their failure," Silas said. "Not yours?" Something inside her shifted, sharp and unexpected. Respect, maybe, or the first fragile glimmer of trust. A burst of wind startled the horse, and Joe tensed, leaning forward instinctively. Silas's hand closed around her calf again, anchoring her. "I've got you," he repeated. Not said carelessly, not said out of duty, said like a vow. The higher they climbed, the colder the air became. Silas paused near a fallen pine, cut earlier for firewood. He lifted a thick, fur-lined coat from his pack and offered it up to her. "You're shivering," he said. "Put this on." Jo shook her head. "I don't want to be a burden." Silas gave her a strange, quiet look. "Miss Davies, if I thought warmth was too heavy a burden, I wouldn't have survived 12 winters up here." She bit her lip, then accepted the coat. It swallowed her entirely, warm, soft, carrying the faint scent of smoke and pine. Silas helped drape it around her shoulders, his fingers brushing the nape of her neck. Jo startled at the unexpected gentleness of the touch. "No shame in needing warmth," he said, almost softly. "No shame in offering it," she replied. The corner of his mouth twitched upward. "Fair point." They pressed on. Hours passed, and conversation trickled back naturally. Small things at first. Books they'd read. Places Jo had traveled through. Simple details of Silas's life in the mountains. His traps. His cabin. The mule deer he'd seen last winter. The beaver ponds he tended. Jo listened, feeling oddly charmed by how a man so fierce-looking could speak so quietly about rivers and birds. "You talk more than I expected," she teased gently. Silas huffed a low, startled laugh. 12 years alone makes a man forget he has a voice. Talking feels strange, good, but strange. "And do I make it easier?" she asked before she could stop herself. Silas turned his head and met her gaze squarely. "You make it possible." Her breath caught. They reached a ridge where the trees thinned, and below stretched a valley so breathtaking, Jo forgot her fear. A ribbon of water glimmered through meadows of wild grass. A small cabin sat at the far slope, smoke curling from its chimney into the pale blue sky. "That's my place," Silas said. It looked peaceful, safe. Even from here, Jo felt something heavy waiting inside that cabin. Her future, whether she wanted it or not. And the moment she crossed that threshold, nothing about her life would ever be the same again. Silas's cabin came into view slowly, as though the mountains themselves wished to test Jo's resolve before allowing her inside. The structure was larger than she expected. 2 rooms downstairs, a loft above, walls built from thick pine logs, fitted with a craftsman's care. Smoke curled gently from the chimney. Someone, Silas, had cut a neat stack of firewood beside the door. A small fenced garden clung stubbornly to the edge of the clearing, but Jo barely noticed any of it, because her eyes fell immediately on the man waiting inside. Marcus Reed lay in a narrow bed, pushed against the far wall, sunlight falling across his drawn face. The green eyes that had once written such warm, thoughtful letters were now sharp with bitterness. His hair was disheveled, his body thin beneath the blanket. A basin sat nearby, medical cloths piled beside it. Silas opened the door quietly. "Marcus," he said in a steady, gentle tone Jo hadn't heard before. "Miss Davies is here." Marcus turned his head, saw her standing there, sweaty, dust-covered, her large frame filling the doorway, and something ugly flickered across his face. "That's her?" he said, voice tight with disdain. "Christ, Silas, she's enormous." The words landed like stones. Jo felt the familiar sting, sharp, humiliating, expected, and yet somehow worse because she had crossed a continent to hear them from this man. Silas stepped forward. "Marcus." "No," Marcus spat. "She should know the truth. I'm crippled, worthless, and she—" He gestured at her body with a bitter laugh. "She's not what I pictured, not what any man would picture." Jo steadied herself. "Mr. Reed, I traveled 2,000 miles. I deserve the courtesy of a conversation, not cruelty." "Courtesy?" Marcus scoffed. "Look at my legs. Courtesy left me 3 weeks ago." Silas's jaw clenched. In 2 strides, he was at Joe's side, positioning himself subtly between her and his brother. "That's enough," he said, voice low and edged. "She came here with courage. You owe her more than this." Marcus's bitterness only sharpened. "I owe her nothing. She should leave. Find a man who can stand to look at her at least." Joe swallowed hard. It took everything she had not to break. But Silas saw. He stepped to her side, gentle but firm. "Come outside," he murmured. "We'll talk." The moment the cabin door shut behind them, Silas paced once, hands braced on his hips, as though trying to contain a storm inside him. "I'm sorry," he said finally, voice hoarse. "I'm so damn sorry you had to hear that." "He's hurting," Joe said softly. "People in pain lash out." Silas shook his head. "Pain is no excuse to be cruel, not like that." Joe let out a long breath. "I can leave in the morning." But Silas turned toward her sharply. "Do you want to?" She hesitated, and in that small silence, something in his eyes changed. A decision formed there, deep and irrevocable. "Miss Davies," he said, stepping closer, "I need to tell you something before you decide anything." He lifted his chin, meeting her gaze fully. "I haven't touched a woman in 12 years." The confession hit her like a warm, unexpected wind. "After my wife died," he said quietly, "I built these walls and stayed behind them. I spoke to no one, needed nothing, wanted nothing, until today." "Silas," Joe breathed. He swallowed hard. "You came down from that stagecoach, brave and trembling and real, and something cracked open inside me. Something I thought was dead." She felt her pulse in her throat, her wrists, everywhere. "I know you came for my brother. I know you're frightened, but Joe—" He said her name like it meant something. "I want you to stay." "Stay?" she whispered. "With you?" "Yes." His voice was raw. "Marry me instead." It was madness, reckless, impossible, and yet he took her hands in his, large, warm, calloused. "I have this cabin, this valley, a life I built alone, but I don't want to be alone anymore, and I don't want you to leave believing his words. I don't care about your size. I care about your courage, your heart, your spirit." He drew a shaking breath. "Let me give you a home, a partner, a life." Joe's lips parted, her voice barely a breath. "Silas, you don't even know me." "I know enough," he said simply, "and I can learn the rest." Tears burned in her eyes. "You said you haven't touched a woman in 12 years. His gaze dropped to her mouth, then rose again, full of something desperate and hopeful. "That's the truth." Her heart pounded. Her breath caught. She felt daring. "Then touch me now," she whispered. Silas froze, as though those words had struck something deep inside him. "Joe," he murmured, voice shaking, "you heard me?" Slowly, reverently, Silas raised his hand and cupped her cheek. His thumb brushed her skin, soft, warm, trembling, and then his mouth met hers, a kiss that was both a plea and a promise. Years of loneliness poured into it, years of rejection melted under it. Joe had never been kissed like that, not with hunger, not with awe. When they broke apart, Silas rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he whispered. "Tonight." She could barely breathe. "Yes." The wedding was small and strange, held in the cabin's main room. Judge Morrison came, bemused but kind. Marcus watched from his bed, stunned into silence. When the final words were spoken, Silas kissed Joe deeply, gratefully, like a man kissing life back into himself. Later, in the loft, privacy curtains drawn, candles flickering, Silas confessed his fears. "I'm out of practice," he murmured. "So am I," Joe whispered. "We'll learn together." What followed was tender and clumsy and overwhelming. Two lonely souls rediscovering what it meant to be touched, to be wanted, to be loved. Silas worshipped every soft inch of her, murmuring things she had never heard from a man in her life. Joe held him as if anchoring him to the world he'd fled 12 years ago. By the time dawn softened the cabin window, loneliness had no place left between them. And yet, the world outside their valley was not done with them. Morning crept over the valley in thin ribbons of gold, sliding through the narrow loft window and brushing across Joe's bare shoulder. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Only the warmth of a heavy arm draped over her waist, the deep rise and fall of a man breathing beside her, Silas, her husband. The memory of the night washed over her like heat from a fire, his rough hands trembling against her skin, his whispered gratitude, the way he had looked at her, not as a mistake, not as a burden, but as a woman he wanted. A soft sound escaped her, half disbelief, half joy. Silas stirred, his arm tightened instinctively, pulling her closer. "You thinking of running off?" he murmured sleepily, voice thick from sleep. Joe flushed. "No, just remembering." He kissed the back of her neck, slow and reverent. "Good. I want you to remember." And for a few brief minutes, they stayed tangled in blankets, warmth against warmth, breathing in the quiet. But the world outside had teeth, and they had only just begun to see them. Downstairs, Marcus stared at his ledger, jaw clenched. He didn't look at Joe when she descended the ladder, wrapped in a shawl Silas had draped over her shoulders moments before. "You're up early," she said gently. Marcus grunted. "Didn't sleep?" She suspected why. Anger was easier than listening to the sounds of his brother's wedding night. Joe crossed to the table and began preparing breakfast. Coffee first, eggs next, biscuits warming on the stove. Marcus watched her, expression complicated. "You don't have to do all that," he muttered. "Of course I do," she replied. "We're a family now." He flinched slightly as though the word hurt. After a moment he said, "I saw him." Silas, smiling. "First time in years." Joe paused in her chopping. "Is that a bad thing?" Marcus swallowed. "No, but it's strange. Like the whole world changed overnight." Joe set the knife down. "Sometimes it only takes one night." Marcus's eyes flicked toward the loft ladder, then back to her. "You two, are you happy?" "Yes," Joe said softly. "And so are you, whether you want to admit it or not." Marcus's jaw tightened. "I'm still a cripple." "And you're still alive," Joe replied firmly. "There's a difference." Before Marcus could answer, the cabin door swung open and Silas stepped in, boots heavy with dew, rifle in hand. His face was serious, alert. A different kind of tension radiated from him now, not the tenderness of hours before, but the sharp, watchful instinct of a man who lived by reading danger in the wind. Joe straightened. "Silas." He set the rifle on the table. "Tracks in the lower valley." Marcus stiffened. "Men? Not wolves," Silas said. "Not elk." He turned to Joe. "Boot prints, 3 pairs, fresh, less than half a day old." Joe felt the air leave her lungs. "Who?" "Strangers," Silas said grimly, "and they were following the creek, straight toward us." Marcus cursed under his breath. "Probably bounty hunters, or claim jumpers, or—" Silas didn't deny it. Instead, he looked at Joe with an expression she had not yet seen from him, an expression that was equal parts fear and fury. Joe, he said quietly, I need to know something. Something you didn't mention in your letters. She blinked. What? Did someone send you west? He asked. Not a matchmaker, a person, a man, someone who might want you found. The question hit her chest like a blow. Her breath hitched. Silas stepped closer. I'm not accusing you, I just need the truth. She swallowed. The truth tasted bitter. My father, Marcus frowned. The blacksmith in Pittsburgh? My father, Joe repeated, voice thin. He remarried 2 years ago to a woman younger than me, a woman who despised me on sight. Silas's eyes darkened. Joe forced herself to continue. I wasn't wanted in the house anymore. I was an embarrassment. Too big, too old, too unmarried. When I discovered my stepmother had been pocketing money meant for me, I confronted her. And? Silas asked softly. She lied, said I had stolen from her. My father believed her. Marcus's jaw clenched. Silas's hands curled into fists. He told me to leave, Joe whispered. Said he'd pay for my passage if I found a husband somewhere far away. Told me never to come back. She lifted her chin. I didn't tell Marcus because I didn't want to come to him like broken merchandise. Joe, Silas said, voice rough, you were never broken. She shook her head. My father threatened to send men after me if I caused him trouble. I didn't think he meant it. But if someone followed my trail, then they're heading here, Marcus finished grimly. Silas moved fast, checking the rifle, then the pistol, then the knife strapped to his boot. He was no longer the shy, lonely widower from the night before. This was a man who had lived through winters, wars, and grief, and survived all of them. Joe touched his arm. I'm sorry. I should have told you. He cupped her cheek gently, the same way he had the night he first kissed her. Joe, you owe me nothing but yourself. Marcus snorted. When he talks like that, it usually means we're about to have trouble. Silas shot him a warning look. Go back to the ledger. Joe, stay close to me today. I don't want you out of my sight. Joe nodded. Silas, do you think they're dangerous? He didn't lie. Yes. The room fell silent. The mountains outside stood tall and ancient, but now they felt less like shelter and more like walls closing in. Joe had come west, seeking a husband. She had found a mountain man instead, and she had brought danger with her. The mountains held their breath that afternoon. Even the wind seemed to still hanging motionless between the pines, as if it, too, sensed something unwelcome climbing toward the cabin. Silas worked in silence, checking the shutters, reinforcing the door, loading cartridges with practiced ease. Marcus monitored from his bed, scanning the slope through the window slit Silas had cut years ago for defense. Joe stayed close, as instructed, though her hands trembled as she kneaded dough at the table. Bread steadied her. A task gave her purpose, but fear hovered behind every breath. Silas crossed the room, set a hand gently on her shoulder. Whatever happens, he said quietly, you stand behind me, understand? Joe swallowed. I won't run. I didn't ask you to run, he murmured. Just stay close. He squeezed her shoulder once before returning to the door. It was a small gesture, but Joe felt its weight. He was afraid, not for himself, but for her. The first voice reached them long before the first man appeared. Reed! It echoed up the valley, sharp as a crow's call. Silas Reed, come on out! Marcus muttered a curse. That's no bounty man I've ever heard. That's a drunk with a gun. Silas didn't answer. He eased the rifle into his hands and moved to the door, positioning his body squarely between Joe and the windows. Stay behind me, he repeated. Joe obeyed. 3 figures emerged at the far edge of the clearing, men dressed in trail-worn coats, each carrying a rifle slung carelessly across his chest. The tallest stepped forward, boots crunching through gravel. His face was red from drink, his beard unkempt. "Reed!" he shouted again. "We're looking for a woman, big woman, name's Josephine Davies." Joe flinched. Silas's shoulders tightened like a drawn bowstring. The tall man smirked. "Word in town is she married you last night. That right? Big gal come through on the coach? Hard to miss someone that size." Marcus's fingers curled around the window frame. Joe's cheeks burned, but she held her ground. Silas opened the cabin door slowly, not fully, just enough to step onto the porch. He held the rifle with the easy confidence of a man who didn't need to threaten to be taken seriously. "You'll state your business," he said, voice low and steady. "Then you'll be on your way." The tall man spat in the dirt. "Our business is collecting property, Reed. That woman belongs back east. Her daddy wants her home." "She doesn't belong to anyone," Silas said coldly, "least of all you." The man laughed, mean and sharp. "You know what her father told us? Said she ran off like a guilty thief. Said she took money wasn't hers. Told us to fetch her back, fat and screaming if we had to." Joe stepped forward before she could stop herself. "That's a lie," she said, voice shaking but clear. Silas moved instantly, blocking her with his body. "Get back inside," he murmured, but the tall man had already seen her. His grin widened. "There she is, big as a freight wagon. Come here, sweetheart. We'll take you home." Joe froze. Silas didn't. He stepped down one more stair, rifle raised, voice turning to steel. "She's my wife. You're not taking her anywhere." The 3 men stiffened. Even drunks recognized the tone of a man willing to kill. "We got papers," the leader growled, "signed by her own kin." "I don't care if you got scripture signed by the Almighty," Silas said. "No one takes her." Joe felt something break open in her chest. Not fear, not shame, something fiercer, strength. She stepped out despite Silas's warning, moving to stand beside him, not behind. "Silas," she said quietly. He glanced at her, panic flickering. "Joe, get back." "No," she whispered, "not this time." And she faced the men directly. "My father cast me out," she said, voice trembling but growing steadier with each word. "He didn't want a daughter who didn't fit the shape of his new family. I stole nothing. I ran from humiliation, not justice. I will not go back." The leader sneered. "Don't matter what you say, your daddy paid us." "Then he wasted his money," Joe said. Silas's eyes warmed with something close to awe. The tall man's expression shifted from mockery to anger. He raised his rifle. "Then we take you by force." The valley went still. Silas stepped in front of Joe, jaw set, finger tightening on the trigger. "You can try," he said. Before either man could fire, a shot rang out, not from Silas's rifle, but from inside the cabin. Marcus, from his sickbed, through the window slit, had put a bullet clean through the dirt at the men's feet. "Next one goes through your knee," Marcus called, voice strong for the first time since his injury. "And I've got nothing but time to aim." The 3 men froze. Silas bared his teeth in something between a snarl and a smile. "Now you're outnumbered and outmatched. Leave." The tall man hesitated, then cursed, spat again, and jerked his chin at his companions. They retreated down the trail, muttering threats. Joe trembled. Silas lowered his rifle slowly, then he turned and pulled her into his arms. You stood with me, he whispered against her hair. And you with me, she replied. Behind them, Marcus exhaled shakily. Reckon I can still shoot straight. For the first time since the accident, Silas smiled at his brother. Reckon you can too. But trouble was not finished with them. It never was. Night settled early in the mountains, draping the valley in a soft blue hush. The cabin glowed like a lantern against the darkness, its windows warm, its hearth crackling with a fire Silas had rebuilt twice just to keep everyone feeling safe. Jo sat near the flames, shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. Every now and then, her hands trembled, not from cold, but from the fierce echo of what had happened that afternoon. She wasn't used to standing up to men like that. She wasn't used to winning. Silas entered quietly, having circled the clearing one last time to ensure the men hadn't returned. When he saw her, something in him softened. He crossed the room without a word and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands into his. You did more than I ever expected today, he said softly. More than most folks would dare. Jo shook her head. I was terrified. So was I, Silas admitted. But fear doesn't measure courage. The way you stood, Jo, I've never seen anything like it. She looked down at their intertwined fingers, his calloused and strong, hers soft and shaken. I didn't want to be a burden, she whispered. You could never be a burden, he said, and there was no hesitation, no doubt. You're my wife, my partner. I meant every word I told those men. Her breath caught. Partner, wife, belonging. Words she'd never believed she deserved. Marcus shifted in his bed, clearing his throat. You two can keep mooning at each other, but those men will be back. Maybe tomorrow, maybe next week. Jo looked over at him. He wasn't wrong. Danger didn't simply disappear because it had been chased down the mountain once. Silas didn't deny it either. They'll come again, he said quietly. Men like that don't like being told no. Jo tightened her shawl. Then what do we do? Silas rose, pulled a second chair close to the fire, and sat facing her. The flames painted his face in gold and shadow. We prepare, he said. We build stronger fences, set traps along the lower trail, talk to the judge about settling your papers so no one can claim you again. Pause. And we stay together. That's the part that matters. She swallowed. You really want that? Even knowing I brought danger with me? Silas leaned forward, brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. Danger found me long before it found you, he murmured. But love, I ain't had that in a long time, and I've no intention of losing it now. Jo's eyes blurred with tears. She leaned into his hand, letting warmth settle over her chest, deeper than the fire's glow. Silas, he smiled, slow, tender, real. You're safe here, Jo. Safe with me. Safe in this home, if you'll have it. She let the tears fall freely now. I will, she whispered. I do. He kissed her knuckles, slow and reverent, as if sealing a vow neither of them knew how to speak aloud. The fire crackled, the mountains exhaled, and the small cabin felt, for the first time, like a place built for two hearts instead of one. But outside, beyond the reach of the warm glow, the forest held shadows that moved, and the question lingered unspoken between them. Had life given them enough love to stand against everything waiting in the dark? Stories like this aren't just about the Wild West. They're about all of us. About the lonely hearts trying to be brave, about the ones who travel far hoping to be chosen, and about the people who finally learn to stand for themselves when the world tries to push them down. Every time you listen, every time you comment, It reminds me how stories travel farther than any horse or wagon ever could. So tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? A quiet cabin of your own? A busy city? Somewhere between? And if you still believe in love that fights back, stay. The next story is for you.